Yeah, I have a feeling a lot of these things we're going to be trying out for these first episodes, and we're going to either sound very stupid or it's going to look wrong, but I'm sure we'll figure it out. So as far as intros and things go, again, I think we'll muddle our way through it on the first few.
Wow, you were really petitioning with that to try and make that the intro, weren't you?
Are we even recording?
Yes.
Oh,
the way you were saying it, you were like looking right at the camera, and you're like,
well, I have.
We're just going to muddle through this, and we're going
to text thing. It's in my prompter.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
I can't look anywhere else.
That's true.
So I didn't know we were recording. Now I'm seriously considering what I was saying prior to this. So.
Welcome to Drunk Real Estate.
Grab a drink and enjoy the show.
Hey there, and welcome to episode 1 of Drunk Real. Are we calling this episode 1, Jay? Technically, it wasn't really episode 1.
Episode what?
Well, we've done this before, but just
the inaugural one.
Well, I did that with you, Mauricio. Remember? Well, just a little background. We started this as a special segment of another podcast, Jay and I, and we grab a couple of other real estate people at a conference or somewhere that we were at an event, and we grab a couple drinks and we talk about the economy and real estate, and it was a segment of our other podcast, but we had so much fun doing just that. We were like, why don't we just do this full time for our podcast instead of the other boring stuff? So but we needed a couple of awesome co-hosts to join us. We made a list, and we went right to the top of the list, and the number 1 and number 2 both said yes, so it was perfect.
We know that's not true.
That's not
we absolutely know that's not true.
That.
We were looking at how far down you got, but it was a ways.
Yeah. We were looking for the best co-hosts available, and they weren't available, so we called AJ and Mauricio.
Elon Musk wouldn't return my call, so you were 2 and 3. So we're starting off with obviously Jay Scott. Jay comes from the tech and business world. Has spent the last 15 years doing the real estate thing. He's my partner at Bar Down Investments, and when he's not investing, if you can't tell from his background, he's writing books, speaking, and doing some advisory work.
Hey, it's almost like you didn't read that.
I made everybody write their own, and Jay's original one, luckily I checked it before we went on the air because it was a little bit different from what I just read there.
Hey, by the way, I just realized that Jay and AJ are wearing the same
Pretty
shirt.
Close.
That is true. You didn't get the memo?
Great minds think alike.
Must be
Great fashion minds.
So most importantly, Jay, this is Drunk Real Estate. What are you drinking today?
This bottle of, I don't know how to pronounce it, Ragusi. It's a Napa wine. It's a cab. It was sent to me by an old friend of mine that I happened to reconnect with last week, and he sent me a couple bottles as a gift. And I haven't yet tasted it, but I'm very much looking forward to it. Ooh,
looks
good.
Great.
Thanks,
Next, we have Mauricio Raoul, who apparently gets upset if anybody else doesn't take the Tim Cook get up when their outfits. But Mauricio is one of the top syndicator attorneys in the country, helping real estate syndicators stay out of jail by ensuring they fully comply with federal and state securities laws. How's it going, Mauricio?
Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, it's going good, man. Looking forward to my glass of wine here. You want to know what I'm drinking?
Yeah. Well, that was going to be my next question, if you want to roll with it.
I knew where you were going, so I anticipated it. No, I'm drinking my favorite weekly wine, which is a Lewis Mason from Napa. Really enjoy that, so I figured I'd bust it out today.
Nice. So 2 wine drinkers, and then next up, we wanted AJ so badly on this podcast that we brought him to Drunk Real Estate, knowing he doesn't even drink.
That's how I know I wasn't first on your list. Because you got all the way down to the people that don't even drink.
Every good party, though, needs a DD.
That's
so
right.
AJ is our DD. Do you have anything to drink? What are you drinking?
This is the Red Bull, and it's a great year. I was looking at it. I think it's last year.
It's a 2022 vintage.
Yes, that's right.
Well, for those of you who don't know AJ, he owns, operates, develops, syndicates, writes books, streams about everything self-storage. He's a self-storage guy, does architecture, debt brokerage firms, feasibility studies, software companies. I can't even
Whoa.
fit everything on this list.
Is
So
playing
AJ
with
does a
Legos
lot.
considered architecture now?
I don't do either one of those. I own an architecture firm, but I can't even play with Legos, Jay. That's not.
Oh, so these are just all the
don't
things
want
that
me
you own. You
figuring
don't
out how to
actually
build
do these
anything.
things. These are just the things he owns. He doesn't do any of those
Can't do
things.
these things.
And last, finally, I am Kyle Wilson. I am Ashley Wilson's husband, is the only thing I'm known for in this industry. And I decided to crack out a brand new, never been touched bottle of Woodford Reserve. The Kentucky Derby was just last week. So I am cracking this brand new bottle open for you guys. It's a special edition, but I thought you were worth it. So I hope you appreciate all that. Perfect. So let's get into talk some real estate. Why don't we?
Let's do it.
Everybody
Do we
ready?
need to tell people
do it.
what the show's about? Or do we just let them figure it out?
What is the show about?
Well, it is called Drunk Real Estate. So we are planning to talk some real estate and get drunk. Other than AJ, he's going to drive us home.
That's
Let's
right.
do it.
So first, there's this pesky thing called inflation that's still sticking around. I can't believe. So what are we now? June 1st. We're still talking about it. We had a meeting last week. Jerome Powell, 2 weeks ago, I think now, Jerome Powell acted like inflation was under control. Everything's normal. We're probably going to see a pause. And then all of a sudden, a couple new reports came out, and it looks like we are not out of the woods yet. So, Mauricio, what do you think? What do you think's happening with inflation?
It's funny, we haven't had to really think about inflation for a long time. I mean, you guys are, what are you guys, millennials, Gen Xers? I've lost track of where you guys are, but us Gen Xers anyway, haven't really had to deal with inflation since the 70s. And so this is kind of a fairly new phenomenon for us. And so I figured I'd start by, let's at least define inflation, because I think a lot of people get that wrong just right off the bat. Inflation is actually increasing the money supply, meaning it's increasing the amount of dollars that are circulating in the economy, which generally leads to increasing prices, right? And so the Fed is super concerned with that, and it should be, because it erodes everybody's purchasing power, and it just leads to a lot of problems. I think the biggest mistake, I've been talking about, having disinflation. I think Jay and I are on the same page here. I've been talking about disinflation in the short term. I think by the end of the year we'll have much lower inflation than we even have today. But I think one of the big mistakes people make is they usually compare, you always hear about the 1970s, and everybody's trying to make a comparison with the 1970s, when really 1940s is a much better analysis, in my opinion. And the reason for that is it's sort of very similar to the situation we have now, where we got interest rates all the way down to zero. It's kind of like at the end of that cycle. Government was printing a lot of money to finance. So there was a lot more dollars chasing goods and services. And so I was going to bring up a really, fun chart, but due to my technical difficulties, we agreed. I was going to show a chart of inflation in the 1940s. I don't know if you can see that, guys. Look at that. Look at this high-tech stuff I'm bringing to you, right? And
That's actually looks pretty good.
Is it pretty good?
Yeah.
So
it's not bad.
what you'll see in the 1940s, which I think is what's going to happen here, is that nothing goes up in a straight line, right? I think you're going to see at some point by the end of this decade, I think you're going to see inflation higher than that 9.1% mark we hit, last year. Everybody's talking about that thing going down, eventually getting down to 2%. But nothing goes down in a straight line. Nothing goes up in a straight line. So I think you're going to see throughout this decade inflation going up, going down, maybe even go negative. I know, Jay, you and I talked about this idea of maybe having some deflation briefly at some point. But I think you're going to get down to, low single digits. And at some point, you're going to pop up and maybe get to double digits. And my biggest issue, and I'm going to do a little rant here because you guys know how I feel about this, but inflation's pretty devastating to the poor and middle class, right? I mean, it's probably the most regressive tax that's out there. It erodes your purchasing power. And we've all heard these stories of, back in the 40s, if you were a single income family, you could afford the house, you could afford the 2 cars, you can afford the kids. And over time, you haven't been able to do that. And what's interesting to me, what I'm really paying attention to, is that throughout the last 20 or 30 years, you've had to have the second spouse jump into the workforce in order to be able to keep up with inflation. And my concern is that we don't have a third spouse. Most whole households don't have a third spouse. So as things get more and more expensive, as your purchasing power goes away, there isn't that out in order to get another person to come in and earn more money, other than having more family members essentially come living in one household. And that's actually what you've been seeing over the last few years. You're seeing, adults now, not even young adults, but like adults 25 through 34 years old, moving and still living with their parents. Last statistics, I pulled this up, that 19% of men and 12% of women ages 24 to 35 were living with their parents. And if you include and you throw in the young adults, like the 18, 19, 20-year-olds, that's above 50%. And so inflation is probably the most devastating thing, and I get really worked up about it because it's probably going to lead into our next discussion. But it's almost like a purposeful thing because you need inflation for certain things, but it's just devastating to most people, and unfortunately, most people don't even realize it because it's kind of a death by it's like a slow death.
Well, you could see by tax receipts the last couple of years, if you look at how much the government has collected, inflation's been very good for tax receipts. Inflation's not a bad thing for the government to happen. If you think about it as real estate investors, one of the best things about investing in real estate is debt, and your debt stays the same, but your income starts going up with inflation or the rental rates. So that's one of the best things. So when you think about the government's looking at the same way. Jay, are you agreeing with Mauricio about inflation where it's headed, or do you have a different?
First of all, I don't think anybody disagrees with the fact that inflation is an unbearable tax, especially on the lower and the middle class. It's as Mauricio put perfectly. It eats away at their ability to live over time. Now, the bigger question is where are we headed, not necessarily where we've been. We know where we've been. We know inflation's a bad thing. The Fed targets 2% inflation, or an average of about 2% inflation. So the question is, are we heading back to 2% inflation, or are we going to stay well above 2% inflation? Mauricio thinks for the rest of the decade. I am a little bit more, let's call it confident. Let's call it, I'm a little bit more optimistic that things aren't as bad as they seem. And I know Mauricio and I have talked about this on his show before. But when I look at the data, I don't necessarily see all the things that Jerome Powell talks about or other people are talking about, not necessarily because I think I'm smarter than they are, but I think Jerome Powell has to feed into the concerns of the typical American. I think when he looks at the data, he probably sees the same thing I do, and which is a couple things. Number one, we tend to look at inflation from a trailing 12-month timeline, meaning we take the average monthly inflation over the last 12 months, we average it together, and we say that's what inflation is. And right now, inflation is 4.9%. So if you take each of the last 12 months, you average them together, 4.9%. But keep in mind, that 12 months includes all of last summer, it includes all of last fall. Let's take the two furthest away months, like last May, last June of 2022, and let's just say that was a year ago, and we want to throw those numbers out the window because it shouldn't really be impacting what we're seeing in inflation today. And those numbers were pretty high. If you get rid of those two numbers, and each of those numbers was like 12 to 14% monthly inflation last May and June. If you get rid of last May and June 2022, CPI, the inflation number drops from 4.9% to 3.3%. So if all you do is say, we're going to ignore the furthest out 2 months in our 12 months, then we're now down to 3.3% inflation.
You're cherry picking a little bit though, because if you look at the last month, we were at 0.4 just on the month. So if you annualize that, we're right back up to 4.8.
And I think that.
No, I said the same thing to my bank. I was like, listen, I didn't pay 2 months of my note payment, but the rest of the time I did. So
and that's fair. I mean, to be honest, I think that 4.5% number is probably not too far off. But here's the second piece I want to mention. So even if you ignore that, dropping the 2 months, let's say we want to stick with the 12 months and we like that 4.9% number. Here's something else to consider. Quiz for you guys. What percentage of the CPI do you think is made up by housing, by shelter?
CPI is 30, isn't it? PC is 40?
So a lot of people don't realize this. Literally 33% of the inflation number comes from housing, and two particular parts of housing. One, rents, so what people pay when they're renting a place, and two, and the big component is this thing called OER, which is owner's equivalent rent, and that's basically, or I'm sorry, rents are the big one, and then OER is the secondary. OER is basically it's a survey of homeowners basically saying, hey, if you were to rent out your house right now, what would it rent for? And so for both rent and owner equivalent rent, we're basing.
Just like to point out, the government just loves to base all their stuff on
and
these
surveys
surveys.
are tough because
Great.
when things are going up, people aren't really good at judging how much they're going up. Likewise, when things are going down, people aren't good at judging how much they're going down. But just keep in mind that for inflation, 33% of the inflation number is made up by housing. 40% or 42%, 40 some percent is the core inflation number, which is inflation when you subtract out food and energy. So somewhere between a third and 40% of the inflation number is based on housing. How much do we trust these surveys that the government puts out to determine how much inflation we have in housing? Last month, owners said that they're seeing inflation based on these surveys of 8.1%. Now, you guys are on the ground in real estate. I'm on the ground in real estate. Are we seeing 8% inflation in housing and rents? I'm not seeing it in any of our markets.
Maybe not in rents, but I mean, look, this owner's equivalent of rents is a bunch of nonsense, right? I think it understates the inflation because, like, for example, where I live, right, I'm actually renting. My rent is not quite half, but it's probably 60% of what the actual mortgage would be if I actually own the place. And so if you actually take what the mortgage rate has been, I mean, there's no question that over the last 12 to 18 months, your mortgage went from whatever
Way
the numbers
more
are,
than
right?
8%.
Yeah, I mean, your rent's gone up through the roof since, let's just take it from the beginning of the decade, from 2020 to today, your rent has skyrocketed way higher than the CPI. Your mortgage payment has not obviously if you're in an existing mortgage, it's fixed, so you're not going to go, but the new people coming in, they're paying much more in mortgage rates. Then you got the car payments, which is the other, big piece.
But the government can't factor in mortgage rates because then it's almost like an oxymoron where they say, okay, in order to fight inflation, we're going to increase interest rates. But if they were counting mortgage rates and the cost of mortgage rates, then what they're doing to fight inflation would actually be causing inflation.
Yeah, but my point is that these are just a bunch of nonsense numbers, in my opinion, right? That's the point I'm trying to come across. Because if you actually look at this is something I thought of actually a couple of weeks ago. As the syndication guy, right? I always wondered why family offices, and this is like not this year or last year, but 10 years ago when inflation was at 2%, I always wondered why family offices always wanted somewhere conservative about 6 to 8%. That was their number, and they're not interested in making more money. They're looking to preserve their wealth from generation to generation. And the reason they wanted 6 to 8% is because that's really what the quote unquote real inflation number really is. It's not this 2% or 3% or made up number that gets manipulated left and right. For everyday Americans, your standard of living, or more importantly, your erosion of your dollar has gone up so much more than what that CPI, which again is just really an index. I'm not even sure it really accurately represents what inflation is.
We all know, and I shouldn't say we all know, but I think we can all agree at least that housing is a lagging indicator for inflation. Typically, what we're seeing when we see the inflation number for housing is we're seeing 3 to 6 to 9 months in the past. So the 8% inflation in shelter cost last month is probably higher than what we all think is reasonable. Let's pretend we can look at inflation and we can strip out shelter, and we can do that because we have all the numbers. Let's say we take out all the housing and shelter numbers. So we look at inflation across everything other than cost of housing and shelter. If we look at the last 10 months of inflation minus housing and shelter, we're at 0.6%. Meaning we basically have not seen an increase in prices over the last 10 months across the board, with the exception of housing.
Now you're pulling out, because the other things that aren't included in there, energy, travel, they pull out all this other stuff. So basically what we're doing is we're whittling it down to this. Let's ignore these other things.
Just pull out housing. Everything else stays in. Everything else stays in except for housing.
Well, and Jay, boots on the ground, like we had, 4 months there where rents were technically negative. As far as rent growth, we had October, November, December, January.
After they went up how much over the last 4 years?
Right, but I guess to Jay's point is if we're using lagging information, if we're using 6 month old information, we haven't even factored in those 4 months of negative. And so
100%.
what's the trend for, if they're trying to make real-time decisions right now. Jerome Powell, every time he's talking about, I want to use real-time data. Well, your real-time data is based off of A, to Mauricio's point, surveys. So how much are you trusting them? And B, even the information you have is potentially 6-9 months old. So should we really be making decisions off of quote unquote real-time data if that's the data we're getting?
Jay, let's do it. I was going to do it. Let's do a friendly wager because I want to do this wager right now.
Oh, here we go.
I think we're both in agreement that inflation is going to head lower in the next 6 to 12 months. I think a lot of the indications are pointing to that, whether it's energy, whether it's commodities going down, rents are going down. So I think by the end of the year you're going to be lower. But the question I have is, do you think at some point this decade we'll see an official inflation print higher than 9.1? I'm guessing you're thinking no, and I'm going to take the yes.
Because at the end of the day, there's one word that encapsulates this entire discussion, and that's demand. That's what's driving inflation right now. A couple years ago, there were supply issues, but right now, what's driving inflation is demand. And I think that we're seeing more demand in the marketplace per capita relative to GDP than we are going to see, than we've seen at any point in I'm not even going to say recent history, in history, and probably more than we're going to see anytime in the near future. So I think that 9.1, that I think it was a 12-month average at 9.1. I think that's the highest 12-month average we're going to see anytime in the near future. I'll take that bet.
Well, the 9.1 basically was because the Fed was asleep at the wheel, and even they admitted that they waited way too long to start raising interest rates, and way too, in my opinion, was way too long to stop the QE. So I guess the question is, are they going to learn from their mistakes? And I don't know. I don't know, AJ, what your opinion is of Jay Powell, but it doesn't seem like to me he's the type who's going to all of a sudden pick back up on the wheel and have everything together.
I don't know. I still think it's transitory. So, I mean, that made perfect sense to me when they said it, and I was like, yeah. I mean, of course, we just made that word up for this one situation, and that is how inflation works. So, of course, I actually don't think that it's that way at all. I think that, in fact, they knew. But what do? Do you tell the markets, yeah, we have massive inflation and we're going to have to rise interest rates to stop it, and then the market crashes while it's still on recovery? The economy wasn't where they needed it to be, falling from their massive intervention during COVID. And I think transitory was the made-up word that came in to say we're going to let this run longer so we can get it to a place where we actually can lift up interest rates. And they knew that if we did it too soon, it's a house of cards. It's going to crumble. We need people to get back to work. We need these things to happen. And if we do it too late, we're going to have hyperinflation. So the point to get to where we need it, to where we can tighten, we're going to call transitory. It never made sense to me. We refinanced our entire portfolio, the fall before, to 29 years, because everybody that we talk to like this, there's no such thing as transitory, right? This is real inflation. So I don't think that so many smart people knew. We knew, and Jay Powell didn't know. I don't think he's that dumb. I think that they just couldn't do it because the economy was too weak. They had to let inflation go. We had to get jobs. Everybody had to get heated. We had to have the economy get heated, people back to work, and then they could do it. Now, was it too long? Yeah, absolutely. And it took them that long, I think, to get the data back to where they feel that they could. But they should have done it months before. I think they were just too scared to tip over the house of cards. So that's why they let it go.
AJ, you don't think any of that money printing that happened during COVID had anything to do with having more?
No, that's the only thing that it had to do with it. It had nothing else to do. We were at the end of a credit cycle that had been expanding since 2008. We had not had a contraction in the money supply. In fact, it was the opposite because debt was being issued. And there was so much debt that was coming into the markets in the private sectors that we were having already inflationary, expansionary effects going on in the economy prior to COVID. When COVID happened and they increased the money supply by over 30%, which had never been done before in that manner and in such a short period of time, what did they think was going to happen? I think they knew it was going to happen. I just think that it was like a rock in a hard spot. But that's the only thing that caused inflation. People saying that inflation was caused by other things is crazy.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think they knew it was going to happen. They obviously just didn't. I don't think they called a 9.1 print. I think it was one of those they didn't take into consideration the supply chain and things like that, and they thought it would run a little hot, but they didn't think it would run this hot, and it became a real issue. So, yeah, I like to take your stance that they knew, and they do have a dual mandate of, okay, they're supposed to keep inflation in check, but also job security and all those things. So they had that kind of in the back of their mind that they don't want to panic the market just coming out of COVID. So yeah, I agree that I don't know if they're going to do it any better next time.
No, I don't think you can, honestly. I think when you make such big decisions, the economy is not built to increase the money supply by as much as they did. It's not. That's not how the economy works. It was not built to not have people work, but still have everybody make as much money as they did. In fact, they made more money during COVID, not working, than they did when they were working. And that was such a gamble because obviously that had never been done before. But when you make such dramatic economic moves, when you play with the economy like that, you're going to get a reaction both ways. And those reactions were, economically speaking, violent. And I think that when you look at it, he needs people to get laid off. I think he thought people were going to get laid off. And I think that's what surprised him the most. He thought we're going to rise interest rates and people are just going to start laying people off and we're going to see aggregate demand drop off like a rock. And that didn't happen. And that surprised him. And he's like, why won't we have unemployment rise? And
well, he should know that, because if you go back to the 90s, every single time that they've raised interest rates and then started cutting interest rates, the unemployment rate has never started climbing until after they've already started cutting.
But not in inflationary periods of time like that. So like when you go back to the early 2000s when they started to raise rates, the economic bubble was already booming. They couldn't stop the debt mechanisms going on. Their interest rates were trying to cool on a top level down, but it's a lagging indicator that speeds up. But with inflation as high as it was, I think they thought businesses couldn't stomach it. I think that it was a point to where they just believed, because he kept repeating it over and over again. And still to this day, look where unemployment's at.
I think you're on mute there, Jay. But I just don't see a scenario, and I'm convinced of this, that the next time we have something similar, right, which could be pretty soon here, that the Fed's just not going to go back to the usual playbook they always come back to, which is lower interest rates, lower interest rates, lower interest rates, and that's not going to cut it. Print more money, print more money, print more money. Again, when you look back at the decade of the 2020s, you're going to see an inflationary decade. I have no doubt of that.
Well, that's a good pivot to our next topic, because you're basically saying that the government's going to continue printing, continue doing what they always did, and that's why right now, if you just turn on the news, all everyone's talking about is this debt ceiling. Basically, the government budget has been blown out of the water because they spending too much money, and the question is this actually something we should be caring about or worrying about, or is this just a bunch of media hype? Jay, what do you think?
So for anybody out there that's listening, we're recording this on Wednesday, May 31st. We're releasing this episode in about 12 hours from now. So June 1st morning. And what's going on as we're having this discussion is the House is voting on the debt ceiling bill. And so I probably should be following that so that I don't say anything really dumb, because for all I know, they've made their vote, and I don't know what they voted. But let's talk a little bit, pretending that they haven't voted, and I have no idea what's going on, because that's the case. What is the debt ceiling? So let's start with that. So the debt ceiling, it's simply a restriction on how much the government can borrow to pay its bills. So government racks up a whole lot of bills. They rack up a whole bunch of commitments to buy things, and then eventually they have to pay those things. And at some point, there's this rule called the debt ceiling that says they're not allowed to print or create any more debt than X. And right now, X is $31.46 trillion. The government is not allowed to create any more than $31.46 trillion. And every day we're spending money. Every day we're deficit spending. We're spending money we don't have. And we're getting really, really close to that $31.46 trillion number in debt. We're going to hit that number. They were saying we'd hit it today. Now they're saying we'll hit it early next week. But at some point in the next few days or the next week, we're going to hit that $31.46 trillion number. And if Congress doesn't agree to raise that limit above $31.46 trillion, the government's no longer allowed to, the Treasury is no longer allowed to create more debt, print more money, and pay its bills. And so at some point, if we don't raise that debt ceiling in the next few days, we're going to have to stop printing money. We're going to have to stop paying for things. Now, it doesn't mean necessarily we're going to default on our debt tomorrow or next week. There are things that the Treasury can do and the Fed can do to kind of stopgap. They can stop paying for certain things earlier so that they save money for the really important things. So, for example, they can start furloughing, meaning not lay off, but basically tell federal workers, don't come into work and we're not going to pay you. And so now they're saving that money and they can use that money to pay their debt. They can pay interest on all the bills and the bonds that they have out there, so we don't default on our debt. And so there are a lot of things that they can do before we default, but those things are going to come with consequences. People are going to be furloughed. There's going to be things that are closed down. Government buildings are going to be closed down. Government parks are going to be closed down. Government's not going to be able to pay its bills to contractors. And so at some point in the next, hopefully, week or two, this will all get resolved. The bigger question in my mind is, what do we do about this moving forward? Now, keep in mind, this isn't the first time we've had to raise the debt ceiling ever. This is I think 80 times since 1960 that we've had to raise the debt limit. So this is something that comes up. It came up 3 times during Trump. It came up 8 times during Obama, a bunch of times during Bush, Clinton, other Bush. I think it was 18 times during Reagan. So this isn't a partisan issue. The problem is that every year Congress passes a budget where they say we need to spend X number of dollars. This year it's something like $6.2 trillion in both mandatory and discretionary spending. So Congress decided at the fall of last year, we're going to spend $6.2 trillion this year. They knew last fall that we didn't have enough room in the debt ceiling to cover that $6.2 trillion. So they knew last fall that we were going to come up to today where we had to raise the debt ceiling or risk having to shut things down or potentially defaulting on our debt. So this isn't a surprise. This isn't a partisan issue. Either party could have said last fall, we're not spending this much money. We can't because the debt limit's not high enough. Or they could have decided last fall, let's raise the debt limit. Nobody did that. So for anybody that thinks that this is a partisan issue, absolutely not. This is an issue with Congress kicking the can down the road, saying we're going to pass a budget that they know they can't afford, and then saying at some point in the future, we're going to have to talk about how we actually can afford it by raising the debt limit.
Yeah, but the thing is that it's not a partisan issue that it keeps coming up, but it always just gets passed. If every single time that this has become an issue, it's because there's been a major shift in who controls Congress recently, and that's why all of a sudden it becomes a partisan jockeying thing, and that's why it's such a news thing right now. Because right now we are so divided as a country politically that every time that Republicans and Democrats disagree with something, then this becomes super, super big news. It just doesn't become news if there's no shift. If you think about it this way, the people who passed the budget, if they're the exact same people, there hasn't been any shift, who have to raise the debt ceiling, they're not going to go back and they're going to say like, oh, well, what we said before, that's false now. We screwed up. It's usually when there's a shift, right?
I mean, much of the Republicans in both the House and the Senate were there 3 years ago when we dealt with this in 2019 under Trump, and I don't recall any Republicans having an issue with raising the debt limit then. Just like when the Democrats that had an issue raising it under Trump, they didn't have an issue raising it under Obama. And so it's very much become a partisan issue, but it shouldn't be a partisan issue. And at the end of the day, there are two things that really need to be discussed. One, should we be passing budgets without corresponding debt limit increases? Should we, in the fall, be saying, here's the budget for next year, knowing that we're going to run into the debt ceiling and have to deal with this 6 months later and go through what we're going through now? Like, no, it's not like literally there are only two countries that deal with that have debt ceilings, us and Denmark. No other country.
That's what I mean. So every other country they figure out their debt ceiling
100%.
when they actually do
so
the
that's
budget.
number one. Do they basically do that reconciliation when they pass the budget? And then number two, should we be deficit spending? Should we be passing budgets that are larger than the amount of revenue that we're bringing in? That's a completely separate issue, but it's very much tied in because that's what the Republicans are complaining about now, and they should be complaining about that. That's a big issue. We are deficit spending. We're spending more money than we're taking in this year to the tune of $1.3 trillion. It's going to be something like $1.6 trillion next year. And so this is just going to get worse. And at some point, we're going to have this hard discussion of, do we just let it run away and hope that nothing breaks in our lifetimes or our kids' lifetimes, which I think is unlikely? Or do we say, hey, we need to fix this? And I think that's what we should be talking about. How do we fix that? How do we actually balance the budget so that this doesn't become an issue down the road?
AJ, you're shaking your head a lot. What are your thoughts about how they're handling it?
Well, I mean, it's, the United States is on a runaway train. If you look over the past 20 years, we've only had two times that more than that, 30 years, we've run a surplus. If you go back prior to the 1900s, we only had, out of 30 times, we had whatever it was, 3 times that we ran a deficit. That's it. And so you can look in chunks of 50-year segments in the United States, and we've inverted. So it used to be very rare that the United States would do this. Obviously, things changed. When the moment we went with the New Deal and we got off the gold standard, we became a ginormous printing press that was racking up unsustainable liabilities. And then we have a political system that, it used to be the Republicans had this idea that we control spending. And then all of a sudden they found out that they could basically spend money on wars without having to ask anybody for it. And then they ran away with it too. And then it was like the machine just didn't stop. And once we got both parties on this open checkbook, it just became crazy. And I think that they're way more they're short-term thinkers. They've got all of these donors. Essentially, we're in a system now where we have a wealth transfer, and that is to corporate entities. I mean, inflation, all these things, debt. It helps the biggest companies. It helps it creates massive barriers of entry, and the normal people, they shoulder the burden of these massive debts that we're taking on. And I think that there's no incentives for these people to change it. I don't think we have structure in place that says, nobody's held accountable. And like we've talked about before, you rack up the debts and then you argue over, oh, well, should we pay it now? That doesn't make any sense. There's no accountability to racking up the debts. So in its current existing format, nobody has any incentives to not just spend money. And I think that it's so big now, it's gone so far that it seems like even a little bit won't help. It's, I think, frustrating for everyone, all Americans, because we view that politicians on both sides of the aisle don't have our backs and they're not looking out for the future. And I think this is going to be, we're playing with a point right now where nobody knows how high we can raise debt. So we don't know. A lot of people say, well, you're going to hit this limit and it's going to start crushing us. And then the dollar's going to get weak.
100% debt to GDP, but now we're what, 130% debt to GDP?
Yeah. And that, I mean, so prior, our spending surpassed 30% in it was 1950 or 60. And it's gone straight up for there. In the entire history of the United States, we never got of a spending higher than 30% to GDP. Look at all other countries that spend over 30% have a 30% expense ratio for their liabilities to their GDP annually. That 30% mark is a very critical mark for countries. And once you surpass that, which we did back in the 1950s and 60s, we've never retreated back from it. So our short-term debt cycles are adding to our long-term debt. Then in the last 20 years, we had two major ones, 2008 and COVID. And then those sent us soaring past that 100% mark. And now we're at 130 or whatnot. But annually, we're still going higher. So we're not even.
You gave them too much credit. It was 30% back in 1982.
Oh, geez.
It wasn't that that long.
It wasn't that long ago.
It was,
so
right.
Look how fast we racked all that debt up, and we started splurging. And the reason was because there was nobody we could. There's no foreign powers that were big enough. We had a monopoly on financial systems. We had a monopoly on the world, military, everything else. And after the 50s, right, and then the 60s, there was no superpower that could even come close. So now, as China is now competing and we have other people that are really strong competitions, they're fighting us economically, we start borrowing. They're not. They're not in that position, and that threatens us a lot. So the short term just keeps adding up, and it keeps going higher.
So, but to take the other side of this, so you could throw out a lot of numbers and they sound really bad, but if you look at the percentage of interest payments that we have to make as a country versus the tax receipts, so money coming in versus interest payments going out, we're actually historically not as bad as you'd think. So yes, it's gone up significantly in the last year because of the interest rate hikes. But it went from 20%, I think it was 19 at the low, up to right around, we're getting close to 35%. But back in the 80s, we were 50% of our tax receipts were going out to interest payments. So I guess the question is, Mauricio, is this news? Or has it just become such a big media news cycle because of to Jay's point, they want to make it partisan when it's not really a partisan issue?
Well, first of all, I fucking hate politics. So this is an NR show, right? This is a non-rated show. I can say that. I hate it. And this is a great example. I mean, I don't think there's anybody who believes that this debt ceiling isn't going to get raised. And all that's happening now, even now, Jay, when you're talking about, we've kind of agreed, or the leaders have agreed on a plan. Now they've got to sell it to their fellow caucus members, and people are holding out, and it's just all politics. They just want to get their own little pork barrel, and I'll vote for this if you give me that, and it just becomes a political theater. And I think, from my perspective, that's what it is. That's all it is right now. It's theater.
Let me cut you off for 1 second, because I want to highlight this point.
For anybody why stop now? Let's go.
For anybody that thinks that the Republicans this time around, or the Democrats all the other times, were actually had our best interest at heart. We're fighting for something they really cared about. Something to keep in mind: since 2011, we haven't had a debt ceiling, an active debt ceiling in place. It's not like at this point the Democrats and the Republicans are going to get together and say, we're going to raise the debt ceiling from 31.46 trillion to 35 trillion or any other number. They don't actually say, let's set this target and try and stay under it. You know what they do? They say, we're going to suspend the debt ceiling. Since 2011, instead of raising the debt ceiling, they simply suspend it, and they say, we're going to push it out to some arbitrary date in the future that they negotiate. And that date, it's going to come back into effect at whatever the debt is on that day. And so nobody knows what the debt ceiling is actually going to go to. So they're talking right now about suspending the debt ceiling for 2 years until 2025. So what does that set the new ceiling at? We don't know. That day in 2025, when it comes, whatever the debt's at that day, that's the new debt ceiling. So they don't care about austerity. They don't care about not spending too much money. This really is just a game. And so I apologize for cutting you off, Mauricio, but I just wanted to highlight that.
No, you're spot on. You're spot on. And this is going to go full circle to what we started the show with. And that, I think the debts have gotten to the point where there's no mathematical way you're going to end up actually paying these debts off. And so what are we going to do? Are we going to default on these loans? No, of course we're not going to default, at least not real default. What's going to happen, and the only way you can really deal with this problem, in my opinion, is through inflation. You inflate these debts away. That's how traditionally governments have done it over centuries and centuries and centuries. And so, again, people talk about austerity, and I think you are going to see austerity, but you're going to see it in this silent inflation mechanism where people are going to slowly have their purchasing power eroded. And that's how you're going to get that debt to GDP number into a manageable number. Because if you just add a zero to all the inflation numbers and everything's the same, we make 10 times as much money, but everything costs 10 times as much, the debt is fixed, just like in our mortgages, right? We have fixed debt. And so if we can get inflation going, which I believe is why the government or the Fed always targets, or why do they even target 2%? I mean, 2% is still, over 5 years, that means everything's going up 10% every 5 years or 20% every decade.
That was one thing that Trump actually was kind of a brilliant idea that never took hold, was the 100-year treasury, right? If you could push out your debt to 100 years and then just let inflation do its thing, then to your point, that would solve the issue.
I read, maybe for the next show I'll get it down, but I remember like Great Britain at some point, I think they recently had paid off some debt from like the 1500s, the 16th century, the 15th century, which, back then it was, a few $1 million, which is a lot of money back in the 15th century. But today, like it was, $100 million or $50 million. It's nothing in today's dollars. It's the same thing in the future. 20 years from now when our debt is 100 trillion or 200 trillion, but our GDP is, some ridiculous number, the debt's going to look a lot less. And I think that's one of the reasons you see governments and central banks targeting an inflation rate of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6%. And I think the austerity again is at the detriment of the poor and middle class via inflation.
And so really quick, because I just checked while you were talking, and so everybody knows that we're actually like really recording this on May 31st at 9:43 p.m. The House just passed the debt ceiling bill. I have a feeling it'll pass the Senate, and obviously the president will sign it. So there's a good chance that this issue is resolved, at least for this time around. But moving forward, I mean, we have one of three options here. We either raise taxes, which we can talk about, but I think we're all probably going to agree that not only political suicide, but realistically, rate.
It doesn't add any more revenue to the budget.
And this is what a lot of people don't understand. If you go and you look at how much over the years raising taxes or dropping taxes has impacted how much money is actually raised, what you'll find is between 1940 and now, we've averaged somewhere between 14 and 20% of GDP in tax revenue. So every year we're somewhere between, you take GDP, whatever it is, it's at 25, 26 trillion right now. And every year since 1940, we've raised somewhere between 14 and 20% of that GDP in tax revenue. And so right now we're at over 19%. In 2022, we were over 19% of GDP in tax revenue. We're not going to get over 20%. When tax rates were at 70%, we didn't get over 20%. And so raising taxes most likely isn't going to work. Maybe we can get it up another percent, maybe 2%. But what's 1% or 2% of GDP? We're talking about a couple $100 billion. I'm not dismissing a couple $100 billion, but our deficit's $1.3 trillion. So raising taxes isn't going to get us where we need to be. We need to do one.
It's irrelevant in the big picture. I mean, it really, it's like people talk about raising taxes. You should raise taxes on billionaires. You could confiscate every single billionaire on Earth's wealth, and it wouldn't make a dent. And I think that's the hard.
You take all the billionaires in this country, you take their money, and next year we break even. But then after that, they have no money, and we're back.
And then the year after that, they all leave the U.S.
Well,
and
they don't have any more money.
So
then they don't have any more money. So then the companies and everything collapse. It's just it doesn't work.
So the other two options are we figure out how to spend less, austerity. We figure out where to cut. And number two, and I think this is actually the bigger issue or the bigger thing we should focus on, is how do we increase GDP? Because if every year we're generating 17, 18, 19% of GDP in revenue, well, if we can double GDP, we can double revenue. And if we double revenue, we can spend more money, and we're still not deficit spending. And so I think the key here is that the government really needs to focus on increasing GDP. And to do that, they need to be business friendly. They need to be labor friendly. They need to be capital friendly. They need to be entrepreneur friendly. They need to focus on education and the trades and invest money in helping people. AI
friendly.
I mean, productivity is the number one way to increase GDP. And so AI is going to increase productivity. Now, is it going to cause other issues that we have to solve? Of course. And I'm not saying I don't think we should have the AI discussion today. We'll have that discussion soon. But certainly that's one thing that's going to make a big dent ultimately in our deficit, because we're going to be able to increase GDP a good bit. And again, if we can continue to collect 17, 18, 19% of GDP in tax revenue, and GDP is a whole bunch higher, we're going to collect a whole lot more money. We're going to have a whole lot more money to spend.
Well, either way, right now it looks like the quote-unquote crisis is over if it passed through the House. I don't think the Senate was the big issue. The House was the bigger issue. So assuming that passes...
Just political theater. It's just political theater. I want to see who negotiated, who got what to get these votes. Like, what do they have to promise or give away to give these votes? Because that's all this was.
Well, McCarthy just wanted to stay in power. He barely got in there to start with, so he had to. He's
hanging in there by
people happy. Yeah, exactly. So that crisis is averted. Mauricio thinks that inflation's here to stay for the next decade, so we're not seeing any change in interest rates for any time soon. So let's bring this back to real estate then. How this affects real estate, and most of us here deal with the commercial space quite a bit. So many people are calling for all of these interest rate hikes and these problems. They're calling for a commercial real estate bubble to burst. AJ, are you in the bubble bursting camp, or do you see all of commercial real estate being in trouble, or do you think that maybe this is just a sector by sector issue? How are you looking at it?
It's a sector by sector issue, first of all, like commercial real estate always is. Commercial real estate doesn't track like when people think real estate, they generally think, oh, the housing market, right? And commercial real estate, oh yeah, commercial real estate's all the same in different states. That's not how commercial real estate works at all. Some commercial states do really good, real estate do really good in certain times, and others do really bad in certain times, and they're affected primarily through supply and demand in local markets. Commercial real estate is outrageously localized. Now, on an overall level, I believe we were already in a bubble. So I wrote about this. Many industries for the past 2 years have been in a bubble. The bubble's already popped. We've already gone through the first stage where we're seeing vacancies rise across several different asset classes. Office space, corporate bankruptcies alone have hit their highest number since 2010 and are rising. So we have a problem in commercial real estate that when interest rates went down, you had very, very large debts. Large debts were refinanced. Office space, as well as a whole bunch of others, were done in large package floating interest rate loans because they were trying to survive through COVID. And interest rate was so cheap. Now we are coming due with a lot of debts. And we're already seeing restructuring, which is the next phase. Now, it's not the same across all assets, but generally speaking, we have rates, occupancies that are dropping. We have rates that are dropping, what you can charge. And this is on the back of the highest point in valuations and the highest increase in occupancies and rates that we have ever seen. So the swing doesn't have to be big to be very painful. Do I think that we're talking about, like, when we say bubble burst, everybody thinks about the housing crisis. That's not what we're talking about here. I want to make sure that's very clear, everyone. That's not what we're saying. We're not talking about. We're talking about, though, asset classes. When the bubble burst, I'm talking about there was a COVID bubble that is measurable. We can see it in the numbers. Everything was overinflated. Rents were jumping both in multifamily, industrial, storage, and a lot of these asset classes. Retail and hotels they were getting crushed. But on the other side, they were inflating. There's super high demand, and a lot of markets are hurting now. And I think that hurt will continue. If you look at industrial, the numbers are shocking. At the development cycle, industrial and self-storage have had a very big retreat over the last 6 months, and will continue to, most likely, due to the fact that they're on the end of a huge development cycle. So they were lacking so much that industrial and self-storage boomed. during the past 6-7 years in a development cycle. Massive capital was allocated to both of these real estate sectors. And it now is coming online, and lots of it over the last 3 years are coming online right when demand is dropping. And we see consumer demand dropping a lot. Now, multifamily is more complicated. Now, in a lot of areas, you have rates that are coming down quite a bit. I know for our local area, we have rates that are dropping in the Boise area. And at the same time, 10% of the total market. No. I'm talking about rates that they get charged. So the actual what they're paying, tenants are paying.
Rents. Got it.
So we're seeing,
Okay.
rents. Rents are dropping, and we have 10% of the market. We have our new inventory coming on the market is representative of 10% of the entire market coming on this year alone. So we have vacancies are rising. Now you can take in this exact same valley though, and you can go to 2 cities over, and that's not happening. So it's, once again, everyone, commercial is very localized. But yes, commercial, a lot of these asset classes are in a spot they haven't been, well, some of them ever, but then others for a really long time. And I think the pain that we're feeling with the debt and restructuring is, first of all, the lending problems that we're having. So lending standards have skyrocketed. And the Wall Street Journal wrote a really good article where they built out a lot on the lending standards, the refinancing and the restructuring that's going on, because they are not using the same valuations. They are not forward projecting occupancies and rents the same. And for people that acquired in the last 2-3 years, and they're having to go through this, they're kind of shocked when the bank looks at it and says, we don't think it's worth that much. We don't think it's worth what it was. And that restructuring will be painful for those that have to go through it. Hence the reason why, like for us, we put way out. We don't have to do any refinancing for a long time. Thank goodness on ours, because we don't really know what the banks are going to do in a lot of these asset classes.
So for things like multifamily self-storage, the thing that we have going for us, we're multifamily, your self-storage, is that you have a lot of tenants, right?
Yes.
And so when you say occupancy is dropping, like when we say occupancy is dropping, like in one of our markets, the occupancy went from average across the market 97 down to 93. That's a significant drop, but that's the drop that we're seeing. But there's other industries in commercial real estate, like something like office, where you're seeing much bigger occupancy drops. So Jay, do you think something like the office sector would have the potential for a real actual burst of the bubble versus some of these more stable darling of the COVID
and I think this
industries?
is probably the most interesting part of the discussion, because this is where everybody thinks that the crash is most likely to lie, in office. Everybody's talking about office. We've seen in San Francisco a couple buildings that have sold for literally 10% of what their estimated value was last year, like literally 600 million off. And so that's getting the news, and a lot of people are talking about office is going to crash, and that's going to hit the banks and hit liquidity and basically take the economy down with it. But let's put this into perspective with office, because again, this is what everybody's talking about. Commercial mortgage market right now is about $5 trillion, meaning the total amount of debt out there in commercial real estate is somewhere around $5 trillion. 20% of that is office. So $2 trillion is commercial mortgage debt against office buildings. Now, any given year, you can expect about 14 or 15% of mortgages to come due, because typical in the commercial space, average of 7 years maturity for debt. And so any given year, you can expect about 14, 15%. So over the next 2 years, we can expect about 30% of all office loans that are out there to come due. So $1 trillion worth of office, 30% of loans coming due. That's somewhere around $300 billion over the next 2 years of office loans coming due. Now, let's assume really, really conservative numbers, horrible numbers. Let's say 50% of all those loans that come due over the next 2 years are in default. 50%. And again, you're going to see on the coast like San Francisco, New York, LA, Atlanta, you're going to see a lot of owners that are in trouble. But if you go kind of inland, if you go into the Midwest, in the middle parts of the country. Actually, office is doing pretty well. But let's say 50% of that $300 trillion goes into defaults. That's $150 billion that's in default over the next 2 years. Let's say,
which would be, anyone listening, that would be so
yeah,
staggering.
yeah, I can't imagine 50%.
Yeah, that would be like, we're talking
Worse than
2008 stuff. That would be,
yeah.
That would
but
be
let's go with that 50%, $150 billion loans at risk, and let's say the banks have to take these loans back, and let's say they lose 50%. Keep in mind, office has the lowest loan to value, loan to cost ratio of pretty much any class in commercial, somewhere around 46, 47%. So basically, let's assume that banks lose 50% of their investment, which means the buildings would have to lose about 70 or 75% of their value. But let's take that crazy number and say banks lose half of their investment in those half of loans that get defaulted on. And so now banks are losing $75 billion over the next 2 years. That's $38.5 billion per year. I'm not saying $38.5 billion per year is not a lot, but compare that to like SVB Bank, which had $200 billion in deposits. It's a drop in the bucket. It's the size of one medium-sized bank. If in a worst case scenario, 50% of office loans default and the banks lose 50% of their investment in those deals, we're basically losing the equivalent of one medium-sized bank in this country. And keep in mind, the big banks, the top 25 banks, their exposure to commercial real estate as a whole is 4% of their assets. So even if every loan defaulted for the top 25 banks, these banks are only losing 4%. The rest of that commercial is spread out across 5,000 other small banks. Now, certainly there are some banks out there that have heavy exposure to office, heavy exposure to commercial. But the point is that there's a lot.
Commercial's regional. Banking, commercial's done regionally. It is not done nationally. It is broken up amongst small regional banks, credit unions. They are the largest lenders, not the Wall Street.
Well, the top 25 banks. So you think of the biggest of the big banks. They only have 4.3% of the total CRE lending in the entire country.
They have very
and so so in a really bad case, maybe there's a $20 billion hit to banks. Maybe there's a $30 billion. Maybe there's, in an absolute worst case, there's a $50 billion hit to banks. That's equivalent of one medium-sized bank out of the 5,000 banks in this country. So there are going to be a couple banks that get hit. The FDIC is going to step in and they're going to protect depositors, and maybe investors in the bank are going to lose money. Maybe banks are going to go out of business. Maybe it's going to impact liquidity a little bit, which actually I think is a good thing, because we go back to the first part of this discussion. Lower liquidity means lower lending, lower demand, which helps inflation. But end of the day, I don't see office as being nearly the concern that a lot of people are making it out. I think if you look at the biggest proportion of commercial mortgage in this country, it's 40% is multifamily. I think we can all agree that multifamily is pretty well positioned. So I personally don't think commercial poses a huge risk to the economy, a huge risk to banks, a huge risk to anything. Not saying there won't be some pain.
I don't either, but if you're in office, it is a big risk. So I don't think commercial is going to
look at San Francisco
economy or anything. But if you're in commercial,
have recourse debt. None of them.
But they'll lose their bill. They're gonna lose their
whether
buildings.
they have recourse debt or not, their business just went under. So like if you're in commercial real estate and you're an office guy, your times aren't good. You need capital, you need investors, you need occupancy, you need rates to rise, you need to make money. And so
the question is, what's going to happen to these buildings? Because the point is it's much different. So when we, AJ and us, when we have a turnover, we put a couple $1,000s in and we get the next tenant in. When you see these major offices, they have a big anchor tenant. They've been dealing with work from home. They need a smaller space. They're still paying these leases. These leases are 10 years, sometimes 20 years. They're still paying these leases, and they have them out for sublease for 20% of what they're paying. And so what's going to happen when those leases come due? And the problem is they're either going to not re-up or they're going to ask for a smaller space. And then that's when you're seeing the San Franciscos with the 30% occupancies. And I guess the question is that what are the banks going to do with those? Because if all of a sudden you're only getting 70% occupancy, you bought this in the last couple of years and you're completely underwater with these loans, the banks don't want these these properties. They don't want to foreclose. So the question is this going to be a systematic thing with the banks that's going to trickle to all CRE lending? Because that's what a lot of people are saying, is that office is going to be basically the trickle into every industry. Mauricio, we haven't heard from you. What's your opinion on it?
Well, I mean, I kind of, I'm in the J camp. I mean, one of my pet peeves is that people, combine commercial and when they're really talking about is office. Like I just literally pulled up just for people who aren't clear out there. I mean, commercial is about 10 different industries, right? You've got office, you've got retail, restaurants, industrial, multifamily, hotels, land, self-storage, schools, all those kind of miscellaneous stuff. And it's a pretty big market.
That's not housing.
Yeah, anything. And it's
really.
It's a $20 trillion asset class, and office, to AJ's point, is in major issues. I mean, through COVID, you had everybody was working at home. Not everybody's come back. Occupancy is way low, and people are like, well, I don't, why would I need this? I'm actually in an office space here. And it's like, why would I need this if I can just work from home? And so either people are leaving or they're just negotiating lower rents. But this idea that that's a $20 trillion problem is nonsense, right? Like all those self-storage is holding up pretty well. I would argue multifamily is holding up pretty well as an asset class itself. Yeah, we got some debt issues on that. But to Jay's point, the office building is a small, I think it's 2.5, maybe $3 trillion of that 20. So yeah, if you're in the office space, you're going to have a lot of trouble. And at the end of the day, price will clear everything. I mean, prices just need to come down enough where it makes sense to be renting it at a lower price per square foot. It makes sense to have a lower occupancy. Well, actually, if you lower the price enough, you're going to get that occupancy up. And so you're either going to have to bring those prices lower, or what I've been seeing some of my clients do is they come in and just repurpose that property. They'll come in and take that office space and turn it into a condo or turn it into a restaurant or turn it into something else that's not office, especially if you're in a market like San Francisco that's becoming like a ghost town. I think the occupancy down there, Jay, you probably know a little bit more because you're formerly from that sort of Silicon Valley area. But what I've been reading is that, that's about 70% occupancy across the board, which is unheard of. I mean, it's going to take years, if not decades, to get up to sort of a norm in occupancy. So if you're in a place like that, maybe it starts to make sense to buy a building and repurpose it into something else.
So what happens to these loans?
That's the problem
question.
Which you're dealing with. And and two, once again, back to this point though, I don't think anyone's saying it's going to blow up the economy, but this is probably the worst spot office has been in the history of the United States in a lot of aspects. I mean, you got to realize the ratio of money lent out today by banks compared with property values is at a 30-year low, lower than 2008. So we're not saying it's going to blow up the economy or anything, but if you're in commercial real estate, banks right now don't want to lend to commercial real estate. It does trickle effect. Regional banks are getting hit really hard. They're looking at loans. They're adjusting values and expectations, the commercial departments within banks. And when you're holding an asset that you don't know how to get rid of it, meaning that if you own one of these huge buildings in San Francisco, what do you do with it? Like, what is there to do with it if you're not running out? So then there's a lot. What you're going to do is you're going to have people that are, going to come in and get value based, and they're going to buy it at a new price, things like that. But it's not a quick turnaround for office. Yeah, like you're saying, we're
seeing some of those like to Jay's point, like one traded for 10% of its original value, and so like the question is, the loan's a lot bigger than that. So what's happening to these loans? Like people, are they just going to default, or are we going to see?
I think they're writing them down. The bank's just writing them down.
Are they going to work with? I read an article the other day that banks are accepting equity kickers now. Like you said, there's a big proponent for small regional banks doing localized lending for these things. They're accepting equity kickers in order to
for anybody out
extend
there
the
that
interest
doesn't know what
only.
an equity kicker is.
Equity kicker, basically, so when we buy a property, we want to make money, I guess is the thing. And so we have a business pro forma that we're going to make some money in the back end. Well, basically what these groups are doing is we will share part of our equity that we're going to make at the end with the bank, if you're willing to give us favorable loan terms to keep paying our bills. And these banks are looking at it saying, I don't want to own an office building right now because I don't think I can even get a tenant. Yes, you can lower the rates, but how lower do you have to lower them in order to make the numbers work? we don't want this property. If we can give them more favorable loan terms, extend this out another 5 years, give them interest only, give them a bunch of things that would help them out, then at least we can keep it on our books at close to fair value, and we don't get into writing down all these values
Keep
of
in
these
mind,
loans.
Mauricio and AJ kind of touched on something that I thought was interesting. Mauricio mentioned that total value of the commercial space is about $20 trillion. And AJ and I both talked about the fact that commercial mortgage space is about $5 trillion. It's not hard to do the math there. Of a $20 trillion industry, $5 trillion in mortgage, that means the loan to cost or loan to value, depending on how you look at it, is somewhere around 25%. So a lot of us who do single family houses or multifamily, we're used to going to banks and getting loans for 70, 75, even 80% LTV. Keep in mind that across much of the commercial space, loan to value, these are owners. A lot of them are owners that put their debt in place back in 2010, 11, 12. They paid off a large portion of that debt, or maybe have no debt at all. And so we're talking about 25% loan to value or loan to cost, which means these properties could drop 50, 60, 70% in value, and owners aren't necessarily going to get foreclosed on. Now, they may.
Yeah, but at the same time, though, yes, you could say that. But now, like, I'm looking at the stats, 15% of office loans have inadequate cash flow. They're having trouble paying their debt.
And so they're going to lose.
So that's a big number.
Commercial real estate did the biggest refi cash out in the last 3 years than the sector's ever done. So there was a huge amount of equity, but two, so much of that equity has been tapped because it made sense at super low interest rates, because they're looking at it saying, I can get all this equity out of my building and it doesn't even really change my liabilities.
Right. And they've already taken that equity out. So if you're looking at someone who owns an office building, they've taken equity out, and all of a sudden now they're in a situation where their occupancy has dropped significantly and their loan's coming due, or even if they have a new tenant. When they have a new tenant, think about the build out for a major tenant turnover. For us, it's a few $1,000s. For them, it could be millions to get a new tenant for that. What do they call it? The CAMs or whatever it is, to get a new tenant into in an office building. So are they going to put in millions of dollars,
lose their properties,
knowing that they're going to?
And that's the thing. I mean, why do we make 10, 15, 20% returns in this industry? It's because there's risk. And we haven't really thought about the risk for the last decade and a half because the market's been so strong. But there's a reason why we get strong returns, because things don't always go our way. And office and some other commercial owners are going to lose their properties. And it's not a fun thing. It's not a good thing. But I think the key is that it's not necessarily.
But what about the banks?
But that's the thing. I think LTVs are low enough that owners may lose the property, but banks aren't going to take a big haircut. And even if banks take, again, a 20, 30, $50 billion haircut, that's trivial in the scheme of things. I don't think it's going to impact liquidity. I don't think it's going to impact, again, it may impact a couple banks here and there out of the 5,000 banks, but I don't think it's going to trickle down.
But it only takes a couple. That's the thing. We could see with SVB and First, like,
that's a good thing. It lowers demand, lower liquidity.
But what's going to happen is we're going to end up with 5 banks in this country. It's going to be riskier and riskier to have these smaller banks to get loans. They're going to regulate these smaller banks even more, and we're going to end up with like think about that. Why right now? What's the incentive as just even a depositor to put money in a small bank right now?
4 of us here. Next 12 months, how many bank failures do you think we're going to see?
Oh, none, because that gates open where you could basically trade any asset for par value back to the Fed, and you don't even have to report it. We're not going to find out for 3 years.
So the concern is this, though. I think, Jay, you're taking it to an extreme. You're saying, well, it's not going to implode the U.S. economy. It doesn't need to implode the U.S. economy. We're all in commercial real estate. People listening to this is a real estate podcast. We have right now the actual commercial mortgage-backed bonds yield, the yield premium to the U.S. Treasuries is the highest spread since past 2008. These are real consequences for all of our business and anybody in it. And two, it's getting worse. So if you're in commercial real estate, we are now first. We just had the first self-storage portfolio of $150 million that's now in financial troubles. And they're working with the banks trying to write it down. And we've heard that there's more developers. I've talked to
And just to be
4
clear,
developers.
that's not your deal.
that are in-
That's another deal that's out there. I just
Oh,
want to make
no.
that.
No,
I just
no,
want to
no,
make
not- yeah,
that
not my
clear
deal.
to our listeners.
Yes. Thank you, Jay. Thank you. Yeah, not my deals. So, but because what you've seen is that run up of money, that's the bubble. It was like you have, and does that mean that self-storage is going down? No. I'm buying, I'm building, right? But is it harder to get debt? I've never seen it so hard to get debt. Banks are just scared. And now you've got these huge spreads. It's harder to get deals done. Investors are worried, right? So a little bit of defaults in these asset classes in our sector and in real estate has massive repercussions. And it's as that gets worse, the banks tighten up even more. Then you have people start to default because they can't get debt or they have to write down deals when their debt was even fine. Now you have restructuring. Now investors are getting wiped out, right? So those are big deals. That's not small. That is investors that are getting wiped out on hundreds of millions of dollars. That's a huge thing. And I think that we can't underestimate and say, because it doesn't blow the banking system up for some reason, it's not a huge deal.
And to echo that point, I mean, you mentioned it real quick there, but the banks are really shoring up their balance sheets these days. They're really, I think, going to be a little bit more lending averse. And so, yeah, a lot of these operators who need to refinance, whether they're multifamily or office or whatever, it's going to be much harder for them to get loans and much harder for them to keep their deals if they don't have a good deal. And it's all because banks are focused. Granted, they have this facility with the Fed. They can almost get unlimited capital, but they're going to be focusing on getting that balance sheet shored up. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Fed is breathing down their neck, telling them they need to shore up their capital, because at some point, not every bank can just pull from this,
commercial lending in New York is half of what it was in 2018.
Right.
Half. And going down.
Well, and just to throw some numbers at you from what Jay was saying before, 16% of all commercial loans are coming due in 2023, and 25% of all office loans are coming due in 2023, which is an issue. But I guess the question is that have we already hit the bottom? So I'm going to pivot this a little bit because we're getting a little long in the tooth. I'm going to do a top 10 list because everyone loves their top 10 lists. And so the top, here it is. I'm going to have you guys guess on these. So it's the top 10 decrease in value of each commercial real estate sector since the recent peak. So what do you think, which sector do you think has lost the most of all these sectors in value?
Which have
Jay, I'll hit you
or
first.
will?
Have already. Jay, number one, what do you think?
Since the peak of...
Since its recent peak, so basically a year ago.
I would think hotels is high up on the list if I look at the recent peaks.
That's not number one. Mall is its own category. AJ, what do you think?
I'm going to go with retail too.
I mean, this should be easy. Number one is office. Office is already corrected 25. So this is based off of Green Street's. I don't know if anyone subscribes to Green Street, but they do a commercial performance index. And so their office 25%.
Is it as of this year? Sorry, maybe I'm getting my.
This is as of last month. As of last month, how much is the current values of the commercial sector since its recent peak? That's number one. The most surprising one is number two. I'm not even going to make you guess because multifamily is number two, 21%. Then we get back to Jay, number three, mall. Number four is actually net lease. So you're talking about your triple nets, double net, single net leases. Then we get into, that's at 16%, strip retail, 14%, industrial, 13%, mobile homes, 12%, healthcare, 12%, self-storage all the way down at number 9, 10%. And then the most surprising thing was with Mauricio there, lodging. Since its recent peak is number 10.
I'm calling bullshit on this right now. Are you telling me that if you take the peak of the hotels, which have been pre-COVID, it would have been like 2019, right, before the COVID hit, that from peak to trough was probably like 90%. And yes, it may have rebounded a little bit over the last couple of years. You're telling me that hotels and lodging, not even lodging, I said hotels. You don't. I mean,
there's only two things on the graph. It's recent peak and then from a year ago, and they're both
from
pretty
a year
similar.
ago. Right? You said the recent peak.
That makes sense.
So
All right,
recent.
then I'm gonna change my answer to Office.
I think this is the appropriate time to change my answer to Office as well.
How'd we do?
All right, so there's your top 10. A couple surprises in there. Finally, finish this off. This is, since we've been drinking, we got to play one drinking game. And I'm going to bring back an oldie but a goodie that I think you guys have heard before, but we had a lot of fun with it last time. So if I were to give you guys $1 billion, but you could never leave the state of Idaho, would you take the money?
I don't think I
If
would.
AJ says no and he loves and lives in Idaho, I'm
Yeah.
definitely saying no.
That's why I
love
changed
it
it
here.
to
It's my
Idaho.
favorite place in the world, but I gotta leave.
What about
really
you,
like
Jay? Would you take
Hawaii.
the money?
Wait, you give me $1 billion,
$1 billion.
$1 billion, and the only thing I've got to commit to is stay within the borders of Idaho?
Yes, you can never leave.
I'm in.
Yeah, I might be
Jeez.
into. That's a lot of
Absolutely.
money.
Jay, what about you?
Absolutely.
No? $1 billion.
That's like
Future generations.
$100 million a year.
There's no way my wife's moving to Idaho for even $1 billion.
Yeah, you put it to Mauricio's point. You just put a decent investment portfolio. You're making $50 million a year without
Put it in
lifting a
treasury-
finger.
you put it in a
Treasuries
2-year
right now.
You put it in a 2-year treasury, you're making $50
Problem is,
million.
though, I would go crazy, and I'm never
Not with
leaving
$1 billion.
here. I live here, and it's my favorite place on earth. But I think I
No,
would go
no.
crazy at the idea that I couldn't leave.
No,
So you guys must not
Jay-
visit
you
the
could
same
fly,
places as
You
me.
could fly Jay out personally to do his famous, little dances for you. For
I
entertainment
could,
purposes.
if I wanted to do podcasts with you guys, I could fly all my friends and pay them $1 million each to come and visit me
I'm
once
in,
a
dude.
once
That's not
a
even close.
once a year.
Not
And
even
plus,
close.
like I don't know if they have this so much in the U.S., but in Europe they have these massive indoor resorts that are these just huge domes. I would just build one for myself. That's a beach and climate controlled
good
and
point. Yeah.
UV sun, and you got enough money to do that.
I'm with it.
That was easier than I thought. I didn't think it was. It's just Jay is the only holdout apparently. All right, well, let's sign this off here, guys. We'll start with Jay. Jay, anything going on that you want to plug, or where can people reach you recently?
www.connectwithjayscott.com. We'll link you out to everything. And if anybody happens to be in Dallas, Texas, I'll be at Dealmaker Live, Michael Blanc's Dealmaker Live this weekend in Dallas. Feel free to come look me up and say hi.
Perfect. AJ, what do you got going on?
Yeah, we've got we got an event here in Boise coming up on the 11th, 14th. So anybody want to connect with me, go to Instagram, or you can just search AJ Osborne Self Storage. You're going to find more than you ever wanted to. So you can do that, and yeah, come meet me up here in Idaho. We're talking real estate and have a
And you
good
can decide
conference
if you want to live there forever.
Yeah, and anybody wants to check out. Yeah, exactly.
That's right.
That's what I was
$1
going to say.
billion, everybody.
Check it
Kyle
out.
will
See
pay
if you would be able to do it. Mauricio, give us a plug.
I want to promote. I want to promote that I'm starting a new podcast. It's called The Drunk Real Estate, and it's going to be amazing.
I don't know. That sounds pretty sus. I'm not going to lie. I don't know.
The only plug I'm ever going to do is follow my wife, Badass Investor. She's smarter than Jay and much better looking.
argue.
So follow her instead of Jay. All right, great. Well, I had a lot of fun, guys. My drink is all gone. It's time to hit the head. So I will see you next
See you
Thursday.
guys next week.
See you guys.
Late.